here while folks are getting into the room. Why don't you say hello to Heather and put your name and where you're from in the chat? Oh, our friend Pat is in Florida with bad Wi-Fi. Well, if any state deserves it. All right, we have a wonderful crowd here. Looks like we've got 60 people and counting. I'm sure some people will be joining us shortly, but welcome everyone to our Women's History Month event with author and historian Heather Cox Richardson. I'm Julie Shiraishi, Executive Director of Eleanor's Legacy, and I'm joined here with Board President Donna Zaccaro, our new Political Director Abigail Martin, who's just started today, and a couple of our other board members, the Honorable Carolyn Maloney, Sarah Russell, Susie Ballantyne, Pat Riley, and apologies if I've missed anyone. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Judith Hunter. Some of you may know her. She is the chair of the Democratic Rural Conference. She also holds a PhD from Yale in American history and has taught at SUNY Geneseo. We'll be adding a link to Theodore's books in the chat. Theodore's is owned by former Congressman Steve Israel, and they're partnering with us tonight to offer 10% off of Heather's amazing book, the bestseller. Oh, where do I have to hold it for the screen? Democracy Awakening. I'm sure you already have a copy, but Heather sent some signed book plates to the bookstore, and maybe you can pick one up and share her message and mail it to a friend. I want to thank Heather for joining us tonight. I'm so profoundly grateful for her to making the time for us in her busy schedule. Heather is a professor of history at Boston College and has written about the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and the American West in award-winning books whose subjects stretch from European settlement of North America to the history of the Republican Party through the Trump administration. That is To Make Men Free, which is one of my favorite books. Heather has an extraordinary ability to synthesize America's democracy's past, present, and possible futures into succinct and compelling narratives. I know I'm not alone in hoping the DNC is reading letters from an American and taking notes on how to frame both President Biden's many accomplishments and our democracy's current peril. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Judith.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Heather, for being with us. I will try not to get too deeply into the details that I find fascinating, like the election of 1844. But this is a wonderful opportunity for us. One of the things that struck me as I was thinking and doing some preparation for this today is that I think most people see history as an accumulation of past events, something we live through or are subjected to. I think academics see history as a craft that's about seeing patterns and anomalies and interpreting events and crafting arguments about what happened based on evidence. But I've asked the organizers to put up an image of Vice President Kamala Harris. Do we have that?
Yes, it is up.
Okay. And what I really like about this image and quote from her is that it suggests a very different notion of history as something we can actively make. How do you navigate among these very different meanings for a word that most people don't even think about?
So thank you for that. I love this image. I also want to emphasize that I am not representing the university when I'm here today, that I'm here on my own hook, which I do a lot sometimes I represent the university, sometimes I don't. Today I'm on my own hook here. So they are not responsible for anything they say, although I don't expect to say anything that they wouldn't that would horrify anybody. So what I love about this image is, first of all, what historians do is, I think, is that we study how and why societies change. So while a journalist, for example, will tell you things that happened, we can say, well, we know what happened, or we're going to do the research to see what happened, but we have enough theoretical understanding to see where the buttons were pushed that created change. And so historians, in a way, I'd love to have that image back in just a second, if you would. What historians do in a way is to restore agency to people. So while a journalist will say, this happened, this happened, this happened, we say, here's how individuals created change. And I think that that's what people like to see when they read the stuff that I write, is it's really about empowerment. So this image here with Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first woman and the first woman of color in the vice presidency, is she's standing there on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, the Edmund Pettus Bridge is a very important bridge in our history because it is where all three of the Selma marches began, when there was, after the one of the people who had been marching for the right to vote in Selma, or he was actually a little bit outside of Selma, was murdered by police officers. In order to sort of channel the community anger from that, the leaders of the registration process in Selma wanted to march people from Selma to the state capitol to sort of emphasize both the unjust murder, but also their desire to vote. So they set off across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the first time they do it, the police officers essentially go rogue and they start beating them. They actually knock a number of people unconscious. And critically, one of the people whose skull they actually crack is John Lewis. Now, John Lewis is going to go on to serve 17 terms in Congress once the Black Americans have gotten the right to vote after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But so when Kamala Harris, first of all, is walking across that in a stride that is illustrative of Ruby Bridges walking into the school, if you think about that very famous image, walking into the school, she's got very much that same sort of stride that Ruby Bridges has. But she is also saying here, talking about the progression of the expansion of liberal democracy, and very deliberately using the words of John Lewis, which is not actually attributed here, but he was talking about the way that you expand liberal democracy and the way that you push back against those people trying to destroy it. And he says you need to make good trouble. So when people have, necklaces and things that say, let's go make some good trouble, they are making an explicitly political statement based on what John Lewis, who had worked so hard to make American democracy more inclusive and to get African Americans the right to vote, that they're deliberately using his language. So this is like both the advance of women, the advance of civil rights, the advance of voting rights, homage to the past and to a great American leader, all captured in this little tiny photograph. I think it's just a wonderful photograph.
Yeah, it really struck me when I first saw it, and I thought it would be a great jumping off place for us. It is, after all, Women's History Month. And I think so many women came to see themselves as actors in history with the resistance, with the fury that erupted after Trump's election. I frequently have joked that the resistance was powered by postmenopausal women, and we're not going away. Um, but I'd like to hear you say something about how you see your role in this resistance and this explosion of women's political activism, because I think you've had a very important part in that, particularly in the community you've helped to create.
So it is worth remembering that the gender gap in voting begins in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. That's the first time that women and men begin to diverge in terms of the way that they see their best interests represented. And that gender gap now has gotten huge, right? It's gotten huge. So that's important to have as a background. But one of the things that I think is fascinating about this moment is if you think about women's lives, and you think about how they've changed since the 1970s, and you think about modern medicine, what you see is that my generation, I don't know the ages of people here, but my generation is really the first generation of American women who have, after their children leave the home and after they retire, the ability to continue to work for 20 to 30 years. But in that period of time, especially after their children leave, they have skills because many of us have been educated in, me all the way to a PhD, but have been highly educated. They have skills. They have worked outside the home. Virtually all of us do that now. They have connections. Often they have money, and they now have the freedom to do whatever they want. And I think it's interesting because while there have always been patterns for how you be a mom or how you be a teenage girl. There are magazines about that and magazines about how you become a young professional and all those sorts of things. There's really no blueprint for how to be an older woman with all these advantages. And I was talking to a woman about this one day, actually in an airport, and she said, well, she was in her 80s, and she said, well, you know what I have done and what I am going to do? I'm going to be a good ancestor. I'm going to change the world for the better for the people who come after me. And I thought, what a great way to look at it. So when you think about this resistance moment, I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of people saying, I got time, I care, I'm going to fix things. In terms of my own role in it, I am the coffee pot that people are gathered around. I do nothing more than that. So I'm a teacher at heart. I love to write. People ask me questions and I answer them. That's all I do. I haven't really done anything other than, be a historian, but because people are hungry for that connection, because they're hungry for information in this fraught moment, they have tended to gather in the places where I can provide that information. And I'm not the only one, by the way, out there doing this. And there are millions of us, and we are operating very much under the radar screen of, say, the modern media, who doesn't seem to recognize that we exist. So for people who are feeling frightened and left out and feeling like, I'm the only one in my county who feels this way, and I'm scared and what's going to happen, you should find your squad. You should reach out, because you will find out that you are actually a member of a group of millions of people. You are not somewhere on your own. And it's reminds me of the populists who came out of nowhere, apparently, in 1890 to take over the House of Representatives by a margin of 2-1 and take over the Senate and elect their candidate in 1892. And nobody back east saw it coming.
Right. So one of the things I'd like to touch on is the role of political parties. Recently, you have been saying the grand old party is dead. And I've got to say, as somebody with decades under her belt working for the Democratic Party, the first instant thought is, oh, the Republicans are dead. Yay, our work is done. Nothing could be further from the truth. I know. Of course, things don't work that way. But could you talk about how parties have come and gone over time, and how names sometimes remain, but the parties completely change? Uh, for instance, I'm perfectly happy with having Abraham Lincoln over my shoulder. And in fact, he is a touchstone for me, and as I'm sure he is for you. So, the Republican Party, in terms of what it stood for, in terms of how it functioned, is no longer. But what comes next, and how does the past inform the moment for us?
So the question of how parties rise and fall and how they are born, I think, is a really interesting one. Let me just clarify what I mean by the Republican Party being dead, because after I wrote the history of the Republican Party, many people would come up to me and say, oh, the party's dead. And I kept saying, no, it's not. It's not dead, because the political parties survive on tradition. That is, if there's a D after your father's name, there's probably one after yours. Not always, but often. And certainly in the Republican Party, that's been true for a long time, actually, since before the 1980s. They stay by tradition. They stay by connections, that is, by mailing lists, for example, and they stay because they have institutional money. They just know how to do it. They've got that institutional framework. The reason that I say that the party is dead now is because it is no longer the Republican Party. It is the Trump Party. It has been taken over by an autocrat. And you saw that just last week when Friday, and today is Tuesday. And on Monday, when on Friday, the chair of the Republican Party, who had been picked by Donald Trump, but in 2017, Ronna McDaniel, stepped down to be replaced by Donald Trump's daughter-in-law and one of his real loyalists. And then they put another loyalist in it as the CFO. And promptly they started firing people. They're expected to clear out more than 60 of the RNC staff. Now, the Republican leader has control over that staff. So why did he feel the need to get rid of the staff that's obviously loyal Republicans and replace them with his own people? I would submit that that has to do with managing to put a lot of the money from the RNC into his own pockets, because he's in real trouble financially. If that's the case at the national level, at the state level, while he was in office, Trump put loyalists into all the state parties. And you look and see what's happening in Michigan, in Florida, in Arizona. You have parties splitting and you have parties that are broke. You also have the mailing lists, for example, or the email lists are now all corrupted. They're about people who will give money to Trump, not necessarily people who want to give money to the Republican Party. So the Republican Party itself is no longer the old Republican Party. It is the Trump Party. And this is the moment when it will be possible to split people who believe in what they consider Republican values away from that Trump Party, because that Trump Party is very openly embracing dictatorships. So if that's the larger story, what happens when a party rises and falls? What happens when a party falls like that? And this is not the first time that it's happened to an American political party. It happens when a party becomes taken over by a small minority. So the obvious thing to look at is the Democrats in the 1850s, but my favorite is actually the Democrats in 1879 and 1880. When the Democrats get back in office in that period, for the first time since the Civil War, they take over both the House and the Senate. And when they do so, they try to erase everything that's happened since 1861. They literally want to try to get rid of the protections for Black Americans. They want to get the troops out of the American South. It's a myth that they leave in 1877. They want to get rid of the new powers of the federal government. They want to essentially recreate 1859. And when they do that, the Democrats were on a roll. That was a really bad time economically in the country, and everybody expected that the Democrats would win in 1880, and they don't. That's when we get James Garfield. And Garfield is elected in 1880 because he's the one who said to the Confederates, who were former Confederates, they were literally former Confederates, who were trying to destroy the American government by withholding finances, which is what they did. You can't do that. That is as bad as what you were doing on the battlefields. When that happens, the American people turn against that. They elect Garfield, and here's the kicker. The Democratic Party recognizes that it can no longer embrace the desires of a minority in order to stay in power. And that's when it does the flip to the northern cities. That's why we get Grover Cleveland in 1884. The party is still the Democratic Party, but rather than focusing on the idea of states' rights that will support the former Confederates in the American South, they focus on states' rights in the North, but that means Tammany Hall, that means doing what's best for your constituents, that means turkeys on Thanksgiving, that means actually protecting Black rights, which is one of the things that the Tammany Hall is going to be doing by the early 20th century, which is bonkers if you think about it in the way we normally understand politics. So what you see is when a party gets so deeply into the pockets of a small minority that it finally bottoms out, then you see that party rebuilding. And on the other side, it usually happens when you get the other side recognizing that it's got to reach for a majority, it too will rebuild. So you get what I sort of think of as, if you know the butterfly soup thing, where a caterpillar doesn't go straight to a butterfly, it's soup in between, which it isn't, by the way, but that's that old saying. I always say that parties rise and fall in a moment of political soup. And we're in political soup right now, as the Democrats are strongly in array. They agree with each other, but they are busy rebuilding both foreign policy and domestic policy in really strong ways. The Republicans are just in political soup. There's the Republican Party has become the Trump Party, but what's left of all those Republicans who don't want to go down that authoritarian route is not yet clear.
Okay. Well, the previous administration has made me understand that I need to care about some things that I never thought about before. You know, the first one that comes to mind is NATO. I mean, I lived my entire life never thinking about NATO until Donald Trump came along. But more and more, I have been thinking about the 14th Amendment and how important it is. And I wonder if you share my sense that there's an actual Republican project to dismantle it brick by brick. It's not just Article 3 and the insurrection clause. It's birthright citizenship. It's potentially repudiating the debt. It's allowing states to fund religious education, which under the 14th Amendment is not supposed to be possible. So can you talk about the 14th Amendment over time? Because it's been so different over time, and the Republicans bring it into being, but then they put it into mothballs. Then it comes out again in the mid-20th century, and it becomes the foundation of all constitutional law. And
You
how
know,
it work.
I love this because I love the 14th Amendment. I love it historically. I love what it does. But at some point, somebody actually said to me, could you stop talking so much about the 14th, because you actually just brought it up at the supermarket, and that's enough. We don't really need to hear that much about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment does a number of things, and the most important overall is that the 14th Amendment, once and for all, makes the federal government supreme over the states. So what that means is this. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. He is replaced by Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is from Tennessee. He's a thorough racist. He wants to get rid of human enslavement because he thinks it's the reason that we have really rich people in the United States, the former enslavers. But he doesn't want any kind of black rights. And so all he asks the southern states to do is to repudiate the Southern debts that they have taken on to fight the war, which is not exactly declaring bankruptcy, but it's like it. And the idea is that you are going to make it impossible for a Confederate system to rise again, because nobody will lend it any money. He asks them to do that. He asks them to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which is a big deal, not only because it gets rid of human enslavement, except as punishment for crime, which is a really, you could drive a cart and horse through that. But the 13th Amendment is also the first amendment in United States history that increases rather than decreases the power of the federal government. So he asks them to repudiate the debts. He asks them to ratify the 13th, and he asks them to nullify the Articles of Confession. That is not to repeal them, which would say, yeah, they were a good idea, but we've changed our minds, but to nullify them, saying you can't do that at all. They do that. But in the summer, mostly, historian here, but in the summer of 1865, he also pardons all but about 1,500 of the former Confederates, bringing them back into the body politic. So when he says in December of 1865, he says to the Congress, when he gives his State of the Union address, he says, I got great news. Reconstruction's over. I have reconstructed the country while you all were out, because they were in recess between March and December of 1865. All you got to do is let the Southerners sit back down. Well, one of the things that the Southerners had done in the summer of 65 is they had done the things that Johnson had asked, but they had also put in place things called black codes. And the black codes created a legal system that put Black Americans significantly below white Americans in every way that you can imagine. And I could tell you about those, but just take my word for it on that one, because we don't have all that much time. So Congress takes one look at this, and Georgia has literally reelected to the Senate the former vice president of the Confederacy. So he's not going to be making laws for the United States that he's just been fighting for 4 years. And because of the fact that African Americans are now going to be counted as full people rather than 3/5 of a person, he's going to have more power than he did in 1860. And the North looks at this and says, not happening. Not happening on our watch. So what they do is they come up with a different system of reintegrating the Southern states into the Union, and that's the 14th Amendment. They write it in 66. It's going to be ratified in 68. But what it says is that, first of all, Black Americans are citizens, so it gets rid of the Dred Scott decision of 1857, in which the Supreme Court said they weren't. But then it also says that citizens of the United States enjoy the equal protection of the laws. So you can't do this thing where some people have some rights and some people have other rights in the states. And it says that they have the equal protection and they have due process. So you can't say, okay, I'm declaring you outside of the bounds of this by fiat. You actually have to have a trial. You have to have all the process of the laws. So you have the right to equal treatment, and you cannot be taken away from you without due process. And what that does is it, first of all, says to the states that put in place the black codes, hey, you can't do that. But then in the final section of the 14th Amendment, it says Congress has the power to enforce this. So once again, we're expanding the power of the federal government, and we're saying, all you states that thought you could get away with this crap, you can't. And this is what gets picked up after World War II in things like Brown versus Board of Education of May of 1954, the idea that the federal government is going to go into the states and say, you can't discriminate against Black Americans. You can't discriminate against Brown Americans, which is actually what one of the first cases was about, was Hispanics. You can't discriminate against women. You can't discriminate against LGBTQ plus people. And that expansion of the understanding of what the federal government could do in the states after World War II is what inspires the rise of the Federalist Society, which says, oh, no, this is judicial activism, because you've got judges making decisions that should be made by voters in the states. And this is why you get the pushback during the Reagan administration of those people who called themselves originalists, which took them back to the period before the 14th Amendment that says it's really people in the states who should decide these things. And this you can see in things like the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision of June 2022, in which the Supreme Court said, no, the federal government should never have decided the issue of abortion. That should be decided by voters in the states. Women are not without electoral and political power. Remember that quote from the decision. And what you've seen, of course, is as soon as things get thrown back to the states, then within the states, they begin to argue that they should have federal control over things like abortion. So the 14th Amendment is, first of all, part of our Constitution. It's no less important because it came later than the Bill of Rights, for example. But what the 14th Amendment does is it protects all of our rights in the states and demands that the national government, the federal government, enforce those protections, which of course, those people who are now arguing for states' rights or for power in the states or the originalists are trying to undermine. And this, to me, it's actually something I'm working on right now, is the fact that those people who argue for states' rights have always done so to solidify minority rule, whether minority rule based on race or gender or class. The reason we get the direct election of senators is because senators, rich corporations, were literally buying up state legislatures and putting their own guys in there. We have one senator from Nevada who actually lives in California in the early 20th century because he's just, he's the senator for that particular trust. You get minority rule in those states, but then they turn around and use the power of the Electoral College to take over the federal government, or in this case, where we are right now, they use the power of the Senate and the filibuster to stop the government from doing anything, and then they throw power to legislate to the courts, which is completely antithetical to our system. So the 14th is crucially important, and I would like to see it emphasized more. And of course, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is an expert in the 14th Amendment, and she is using it in those ways, and she's doing so very powerfully. So she's someone to watch.
Fascinating. So people have submitted questions. Some came in beforehand. One is from Jane Dodds, who asks, is there a gentle way to change the thinking of people who still wave the stars and bars?
Is there a gentle way? Well, the history of the stars and bars is actually pretty complicated. Is there a gentle way to change that? Because in this moment, it means something really specific. And I'm thinking of all the pickup trucks I see here in Maine that say heritage, not hate. And I'm like, nah, not really. Your ancestors fought for the United States, not for the Confederacy. The only thing that I would maybe point out is that it has become an anti-government symbol. It took on that anti-government symbol in the 1960s when people in the North began to embrace it because they opposed the Vietnam War and the people who were pushing the Vietnam War, which is how you get it showing up so much in the North in the 1970s. But then in the period of the New South, when we get the rise of Jimmy Carter, you actually had people like Leonard Skinner flying the stars and bars, which is not the Confederate flag, by the way. It's the battle flag of the Confederacy. And Leonard Skinner ceased to fly it. They insisted it be taken down after the period when it initially meant we're going to fight back against the government and create this new South and create a and get out of Vietnam, and ceased to fly it because they thought that it was anti-American. I mean, maybe that's the only way to soften is an anti-American flag. It really is an anti-American flag.
Yeah,
It's an
absolutely.
interesting question. I've never had that one asked.
Yeah. Betsy Briggs has submitted a question that I certainly identify with. She is a resident of the North Country and has the misfortune of being represented by Elise Stefanik. I have the misfortune of being represented by Claudia Tenney, who flies a little lower under the radar, but is just as crazy. And Betsy's question is there a way to approach the so-called untouchable congressional districts rather than only focusing on the flippable ones, the swing districts? Should we continue to focus only on those places where we can make pickups? But how has that worked in the past?
So I am not a political strategist. And you obviously should work with the people who know how much money you have, how much people power you have, how much time you have, rather than taking my advice for anything political or probably anything. But what I would say is this. I talked about theories that historians look at when we look at how change happens in a society. And I believe that ideas change societies. I'm an idealist. And that means that I believe that the paramount thing to do to change a society is to change ideas. And if that's the case, absolutely, we should be active everywhere, because even if you're not going to win that race, you're going to change somebody's mind. And if you change that one person's mind, they might change somebody else's mind. And this is one of the things I always emphasize to the people that listen to me online, or that's really where I do my political stuff is online, is that it's all advertising. And I always tell people, run for office. Even if you're going to lose, that's not the point. The point is that you are making it clear that there are other ideas out there, and your ideas are not outlandish. One of the things to remember is when we talk about the ideas that are currently represented by the Republican Party, as I said, more than 80% of us believe in common sense gun safety legislation, more than 80%. So in that district, and and I'm from a gun-toting community myself, there are plenty of people who formerly were members of the NRA and who have now left because of everything the NRA came to symbolize, and who have plenty of guns, but who don't like where we are right now. And they would like to know that there are people that they can see as reasonable on this issue on the other side. So to me, if your plan is to change ideas, where those people are, sometimes it's more important to go to the places where you're less likely to win an election than you are to find people who are hungry to hear new ideas. But on that, again, I would defer to people who do the political stuff for a living rather than me.
Sure. Kate Alonso asks, what do you see as the most effective message to turn out voters for Biden and down ballot candidates?
So I will tell you what I see, and I will tell you what people who study politics see. People who study politics say that they see as most effective in this election the Dobbs decision and the increasing assault on women's reproductive rights, which is not a partisan issue, and it is not a women's issue exclusively. The fact that women are now in danger of dying because of pregnancies gone wrong, the states that don't have exceptions for rape and incest, the fact that women can no longer plan their families, which of course the idea of Planned Parenthood was largely on the Republican side when it first became part of the American experience. It was actually the Romney family that was strong behind Planned Parenthood. So the people who study politics will tell you that that's this issue, and the numbers will support it. Every time that reproductive health is on the ballot, Democrats have been overperforming by as many as 8 points, but certainly as few as 6. That's huge. But I will tell you, and I could be wrong for sure, I will tell you that what in the past has made a difference is making people feel like their vote really matters for something bigger than themselves. And Dobbs does that to some degree. But what we are doing in 2024 is we are deciding whether or not American democracy is going to survive. And that's not a joke. That's not posturing. That's not something that some slick ad campaign came up with. That is the truth, that this election is about the survival of democracy in the United States of America, and therefore the health of democracy around the globe at a time when it's on the ropes in both internally and also internationally. And the world will survive, the country will survive 4 years of Joe Biden, even if you hate Joe Biden. I don't. I was not a Biden supporter. I'm now a huge supporter. I did not expect to be one, let me tell you. But even if you don't like Joe Biden, the country will survive if he remains president. The country will not survive as a democracy if Trump remains president. And I think that there are plenty of people, first of all, who are previously apathetic, who are open to that argument, but also even Republicans who are open to that argument. And you can look at things like the fact that Adam Kinzinger, of course, everybody points to, or George Conway, Liz Cheney, and all the people that they have inspired to say, wait a minute, we might not be Democrats, but we're sure not Trumpers. And so, again, the political money says the issue is reproductive rights, reproductive health. My historical perspective will tell you that the 1860s, the 1850s, leading into the 1860s, what Abraham Lincoln did is he convinced a bunch of white men, often propertied white men, that it was in their interest to stand against the people who were enslaving Black people in a thoroughly racist time. And he did it by saying, the Declaration of Independence says that we have the right treated equally and that we have a right to have a say in our government. And the Confederates, or the Southerners, the elite Southerners are trying to destroy that. And he got people to agree with him and to recognize that unless they protected the right to be treated equally, they would all be in danger of being enslaved or of losing their rights to speak on the floor of Congress, for example, which is why Charles Sumner became such a big thing. If you look at the rise of Theodore Roosevelt after 1884, Theodore Roosevelt's a rich guy from New York, a member of the elite himself, and he gains power by saying, listen, our country is not fair right now. We need to give everybody a square deal. Everybody gets to have the same rights. Similarly, FDR manages to get people behind him by saying, we are defending democracy against an oligarchy that is taking it over. And at least I have read that the Biden administration, the people handling Biden kept saying, stop talking about democracy, talk about these specific issues. And he went with talking about democracy in that major speech, and I don't remember the date of it now, got a huge bump afterward that surprised a lot of people. And it doesn't surprise people like me, because I think Americans want to believe that their vote matters. And it matters if you're voting against a dictator more than it matters if you're voting for, debt relief, for example. Kitchen table issues matter for sure, but only when they are wrapped into, I think, a larger picture of what kind of government we want to live under.
Be good ancestors.
Be good ancestors.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that you're optimistic?
In a free and fair election, I am beyond optimistic. A free and fair election would have this country in an extraordinarily different place. But we have had voter suppression since 1998. 1998, I didn't misspeak. We have gerrymandering now that is affecting the state houses across the country, many of which have supermajorities that they have not earned. We have, I think, the very deliberate attempt on the part of the Trump campaign not to win this election. Have you noticed they're not actually reaching out to anybody? They're not trying to broaden their base at all. They're actually making their base smaller, which suggests to me they're not trying to win this election. They're trying to steal this election. So in a free and fair election, I'm very optimistic about America and the American people. I am extremely concerned about this election. So one of the things that we need to do is to get people enthusiastic about voting, make these numbers so huge they can't be overturned, and to make people recognize that this is our moment. By 2028, the demographics have changed so significantly in the United States that the policies that the Democrats are embracing will be empowered in 2028. But the kicker is we need to have an election in 2028, which makes this election our election, and the election that we have to make sure we preserve, we win so that we preserve the election in 2028. And so it's kind of a mixed answer. I'm very optimistic about the American people, very concerned about what the Trump people are up to. And all I can say is that we have to win this one, because losing it is really not an option.
Right. Well, I know that some questions have come in over the chat that Julie has been shepherding for us, but before I let Julie ask those questions, I just want to toss out there, I think there could be a dynamite letter comparing Donald Trump to Andrew Johnson.
Haven't I written one? Maybe I haven't. That's a really good idea. That's a great idea. Oh my God, Johnson compared himself to Christ, That's one of the things that sank him.
I know.
Interesting.
I was reading, doing some reading for this, and I came across that, and it hit me in the face.
Yeah, it was really embarrassing for everybody except him. Interesting. I'm going to write this down here, because people have compared him to Jackson, but not to Johnson. Of course, nobody really remembers Johnson.
Well, except they both battle for worst president in the rankings. So
and Benjamin Harrison is sadly neglected in that list because he was really bad. He gave us 6 new states so he could pack the Senate, and Wounded Knee folks. And nobody ever talks about It's like they talk about the Wounded Knee massacre without ever mentioning that it was Harrison's attempt to try and regain control over the Senate after the 1890 blowout midterm election that gave everything to the Democrats.
Well, my personal addition to that pantheon would be James Polk.
Yeah, Polk doesn't get a lot of press either, I gotta say.
Yeah, so Julie, are there some questions?
Yes, there's a few questions in the chat, Judith, and then I've got one of my own. Just going to scroll back here. Cynthia Appleton asks, is there a time in our history that is comparative to today politically other than the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, we look a lot like the 1890s. We look a lot like the 1920s and the early 1930s. And in both of them, I mean, maybe there's a larger pattern here in the sense that in all of these periods, what we're really dealing with is a minority of people who either for financial reasons or racist reasons or sexist reasons are trying as a minority to exert their will over the majority. And in each of those periods, what is really causing the rub is not that they're trying to do that, because they've been able to do it in the 1850s. For example, the elite enslavers run everything. And in the 1880s into the 1890s, the robber barons, as we now call them, were able to run everything. And in the 1920s, same, right, with the government handing everything over to business. But what really causes the problem is when the majority kind of wakes up and says, wait a minute here, this is not what we want. This is not democracy. And it's at that point that that minority starts to get really violent. It starts to exert, to say, wait a minute, you're changing the game here. This is the way things work. And you can see this in this moment, for example, in the extraordinary pushback that the Biden administration has gotten for trying to do things like negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. Every other country in the world does it or has some form of price caps on drugs. But the fact that the United States is now saying, wait a minute, you guys have taken way more than you had the right to. Now they're screaming, hey, you're being unfair to us. So there's been this long process in the United States. And in each of those moments, what has happened is a very slow sort of grinding turn. I'm thinking of the 1890s here. But if you think about that turn in the 1890s where the American people kind of woke up, first of all, it was crazy violent. The police came down on strikers like nobody's business, and often helped by the government. But then once the American people started actually electing progressives, as they were called in that period, by 1912, there were 4 people running for president in that year, and all of them were progressives. So once the turn starts, it really takes off. But we're in that period of just starting that turn, I think. And you could say the same thing about the 1930s and how the Republican Party adopts the policies of the New Deal. And by the time of Eisenhower, you've got the Republican version of that called the Middle Way. And we live with that form of government from really 1933 until 1981. So we're in a period like that again. And while it's terrifying to be in, it's also a time of extraordinary creativity where people are, in the 19th century, experimenting with new kinds of art and new kinds of sculpture and new kinds of music, ragtime, right? New kinds of music and new kinds of political organizations and new ways to think about the world, new inventions, new patents. Most fertile time in American patent history is in the late 19th century. So we're also, for all the fear we're in an extraordinarily creative period. And it's one of, I think, great joy and opportunity as well as of fear. So yes, we're in something that's looked very much like the past. We have never lost a major political party to a dictator, which we have done now. So that makes it unusual. But the rest of us are still here, and we're all still the same as we were in those days when we managed to take the country back from people like that.
I think that might cover Terry's question about parallels between our current moment and Germany pre-World War II. Terry, you can put in the chat if I didn't quite answer that.
I can't do Germany. I'm an Americanist. I can tell you anything about America, but any other country I know as much as anybody on the street.
Got it. So we have a question from Jill Fieldstein. I'm going to skip over my doppelganger there. Do you see any connection between the state of our education system and the willingness of so many people to believe in the lies being fed to them?
I do. And I am extremely concerned about the voucher movement right now, which is trying to destroy public education, because there is an intellectual problem in democracy, right? How do you make sure that people understand what is in their best interests? And the way that you square that circle, if you will, in my mind, is the same as Abraham Lincoln thought. And my friend Joanne insists Thomas Jefferson thought the same way, but I refuse to give Thomas Jefferson any good press. So I disagree with that, completely uninformed. But the way you square that circle, the way you make democracy not mob rule, which was something that the founders worried a lot about, is through education. And by having a strong public school system, which is vital to creating a national sense of self and to creating an understanding of democracy. And of course, we have walked away from that in not only in the cuts to education, the dramatic cuts that we've had to education since the 1980s, but also I think in the way that people like me have taught American history, which has tended to see it in a very siloed way that it didn't necessarily have to be. So I'm very concerned about it and very eager to rebuild our public school system. You know, one of the things that I find that's interesting is, you may not know this, but the reason we have a Tour de France is because France realized that it needed to be brought together as a nation. So it is literally people going around France so that they would follow the different regions in France. And part of that was the other part of that was to have a curriculum that people would share. And that, of course, was the idea behind the Common Core curriculum, was the idea that all of the United States would have the same system. It wouldn't teach the same stuff, but you'd have biology in the same years in high school so that you could go from one state to another without missing out on understanding how to dissect a pig or whatever one does in biology. So I'm very concerned about that. I'm very eager to bring it back. When this gig is over, when people no longer need me, I expect to be working much more fully in K through 12 education, which I think is the heart of everything, really.
Well, I don't see a point at which we don't need you, but we appreciate that you're committed to helping future generations prevent the erosion of democracy. I'm going to take a question here from Lisa Jessup here. Wasn't the Civil War just an insurrection? There's a lot of talk about polarization and potential civil war, but wouldn't this just be an expanded insurrection, as in it just isn't two sides, but one side, which is just criminal?
They actually called it the War of the Rebellion or the War of the Insurrection in the 19th century. If you were on this side of the United States, the South, of course, had its own name for it. They called it the War between the states, and that matters. Those two different things matter because with the second one, as you say, it gives credence to the idea that what the Southerners were doing was legitimate. The idea of it being a war of rebellion or that the United States was facing an insurrection says exactly that. The Southerners were trying to tear apart the United States. And that's an important distinction. And it's one I think that is important today, because one of the things that you have when you have an insurrection is you have, or a rebellion, is you should punish the people who do it. And one of the things that I carry with me forward from my study of the Civil War and Reconstruction is that nobody in the United States, none of the former Confederates, paid any price for what they did in terms of a war that killed 600,000 people and cost almost $6 billion. And one of the things that is interesting to me today is the fact that the Department of Justice, which is formed in 1870, by the way, so it's a while after the Civil War, and it's formed for the federal government to protect the rights of Black Americans in those southern states, as I was talking about before. The Department of Justice has been going after people who participated in the insurrection. Why does that matter? Because they're only the low-hanging fruit at this point. Why does that matter? Because I think it makes it less likely that that will happen again in the present. And one of the things I watched very closely was when a number of people tried to get together a truck convoy to go down to the southern border of the United States in Texas, and they were only able to get together 19 trucks, none of which were semis. They were all personal trucks, and then they ended up getting diverted into some sort of a prayer meeting, and everybody got mad and went home. That matters because it was yet another moment in which the Trumpers were calling for people to turn out to support either Donald Trump or, in this case, his policies, and they have not been doing so. They didn't turn up for his indictments. They didn't turn up for this border truck thing. And increasingly, I think it's going to be harder to convince people to turn out for Trump, although I think that that's what he's doing when he's urging them to be so violent. That being said, I think in the states, there are people who are still willing to be violent. You saw that in Kansas over the weekend when they had the mannequin of Trump and urged people to be violent against it. And crucially, we have not brought punishments for those people who were farther up the chain. Now, Peter Navarro is supposed to go to prison in the next week or so. There are people who are starting to pay a price for their role in fomenting the rebellion or the insurrection of 2021. But not very many of them. And of course, Trump is running to make sure he can get out of it himself and to pardon himself. And that concerns me a lot. So, I'm not worried about an old-fashioned civil war where people are shooting at each other in lines. I think we are already to some degree in a civil war in which people are acting as lone wolves or acting as individuals. And we certainly are in a war over ideas. And that war over ideas is not only about America, it's also about foreign influences that are doing things like flooding us with disinformation to win the war. So yeah, basically we are looking at an information insurrection and the potential for the kind of low-level individual stuff that we saw in January 2021, and possibly in the states, which might disrupt the 2024 voting.
Thank you. I just want to correct because the dummy that was being attacked had a Biden mask, just because you said Trump. Just want to make sure
Oh,
that.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. They each have 5 letters. I see things in numbers in my head. It was a Biden. It was a mannequin with a Biden head on it, and it was in an official event. So some people have said, well, people wear Trump masks or whatever. There's a difference between it being an official party event and somebody doing whatever they want in their own space on their own time.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. I want to be conscious of your time here because I know you have a newsletter that you're working on tonight. So, I apologize to the folks who have questions in the chat that we haven't quite gotten to. But I want to take the privilege of asking the last question, which is our organization is focused specifically on working to support pro-choice Democratic women running for the state and local level. So we don't get involved in the congressional races, the presidential races. We think of ourselves as getting women in the door politically, and also giving them the experience and building the bench. But one of the challenges that we face is that in New York, especially in non-presidential years, Democratic turnout really plummets. Even year elections might change that, but if you're running for town supervisor or village justice, we struggle with turnout. What do you think we can do to help turn out more Democratic voters every year, not just in presidential years?
Well, you know that the most effective thing in political activism is talking to your friends. And again, finding your squad. And one of the things that I see happening everywhere is people doing exactly that. They're meeting people, and they're meeting up with people that think the same way they do. And just as an aside here, this is exactly the same way the John Birch Society organized in the 1950s. Is they organized around, remember the whole thing about coffee clutches? Well, there's no reason that those same techniques can't be used for progressive causes, for democratic causes. But that being said, one of the things that I always emphasize is that it's really important to be involved at the national level, but it's the local level that really matters. And everybody needs to turn out for every election. And that's one thing that, again, Tom Nichols of The Atlantic, I think I might have mentioned him before, used to be a Republican, now he is not. And he always says, the reason the Democrats lose is because the Republicans always turn out. End of discussion. And these elections nowadays are turnout elections. But then that kind of begs the question, how do you get people to turn out? You make sure your friends, everybody you know is registered, has a ride to the polls, understands how important it is, and actually turns out. And that's, again, what you do with individual organizing, local organizing, and talking to your friends so that you make sure people actually turn out. That is more effective than anything else, is talking to your friends and making sure they turn out, and to make sure they show up for things. My big things is school board meetings, making sure you show up for local events so that they are not taken over by the radical right who, hijacks things and has been hijacking things all over the country.
Well, thank you, Heather. I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, we're so grateful to you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. I know there are a million readers more who sign up and read your Substack every day. But your words really mean a lot to those of us who collect petitions and knock on doors and try to build that community that you talk about. So thank you so, so much.
Let me respond to that and say that's very sweet, but thank you. Because honestly, I don't do very much. I read and I write. It's the people who are out there with their feet on the ground, knocking on doors, running for office, speaking up, finding their voice, taking the kind of agency that I write about, who are the real heroes of this story. And so I'm really happy to be here, but I am humbled to be here with people who are actually doing the real work, as opposed to, I shiver a little bit in this writing room. So thank you for what you all are doing, and I'm 100% behind you, and let's do it. This is ours. This is our time to make it into the history books. And right now I'm writing them, so let's do it, and let's make sure we bring this one home. And I think we can. And thank you for everything you're doing.
Well, thank you. I want to also thank Judith for moderating. You did a great job, and it means a lot to us to have you here. And thanks to everyone in attendance who came out to support our mission of electing more pro-choice Democratic women, and to taking the words that Heather said and making sure that we're out there communicating her message to voters, to our communities, because we are all here because we believe in democracy, and each of us understands that it is not a spectator sport. I know we all do a lot, and we need to keep doing a lot and do more this year. I see a lot of our candidates and electeds out there. I'm sorry I can't give you all a shout out, but I thank you, echo what Heather says. Thank you for stepping up to run. Now, let's take Heather's reminder of what's at stake and what's possible this year, and let's get out there and win this November. Thank you all.